Hello and welcome back to The Independent Pianist. I'm your host, Cole Anderson. As usual, I have to apologize for my absence from the YouTube scene. It's been a couple weeks now that I missed my usual uploads, and I do have, I think, a pretty good excuse. I hate to miss these uploads because it's so enjoyable for me, and I so enjoy getting to interact with the viewers. But I just got really overwhelmed the past couple of weeks when I got back to kind of my collaborative work that I do in the Bay Area. In particular, there was a project that I took on playing new music. A bunch of young composers at the San Francisco Conservatory. I'm part of a quartet, and we're playing all these new compositions, and there were about a dozen and a half pieces or so. I think there are about 18 or 19 pieces with piano that I needed to learn in the space of just a couple of weeks. And if you've ever tried playing pieces from new composers, and particularly somewhat inexperienced composers, what you'll find is that they're very wonderful and enjoyable works. They have a lot of enthusiasm and imagination. However, sometimes they're not always entirely practical. They might not be aware of certain practicalities regarding the instrument or how the instruments can fit together. So I found myself having to deal with kind of rearranging certain things or figuring out how to play things effectively and figuring out advice that I could give the composers as well when we had our read-through for them. And actually the final read-through is this Saturday. We're playing a bunch of these works on this Saturday, and last Saturday we did the first installment of that. So I'm almost done with the first part of the project, and I've basically learned everything, so now I actually have a little bit more mental space to talk to you guys. I've still been plugging along and recording, and I recorded some stuff like Brahms' Opus 117 number 3. I've been talking about those 3 intermezzi, so I do have a recording of that piece, which I'm going to be talking about here pretty soon. And I've also started to re-record the Earl Wild Gershwin etudes. Many of you may have originally found me on my other channel playing all the Earl Wild Gershwin etudes. That was a set of etudes that I learned during my doctorate, or immediately after my doctorate, I believe. And I played for many years, and I made this kind of impromptu recording of them in 2000, I think it was 2019, before COVID. And that recording is, it wasn't exactly my best playing ever, but I put it up, and a lot of people actually found it and have said that they really liked it. So I wanted to get a chance to just kind of analyze those transcriptions in more detail, since they're wonderful, wonderful transcriptions of wonderful songs by Gershwin. So I also have one of those, which I've already recorded, and I'm planning to work through all of them again, and so those are going to be coming up pretty soon. Also, I've just been having a lot of thoughts about practicing and about how to organize my practicing and how to push my technique to the next level, whatever that may be for me. So I have a lot of thoughts, a lot of things I've been kind of toying around with that I'd be interested talking about with you viewers. So I haven't been totally stagnant. I've been percolating, thinking about things, and there's lots of material that's going to be coming up pretty soon. I thought that this week, given how busy I've been, I would just record a little bit of my practicing, actually, and just talk to you about some of the things that I do. So in addition to all that stuff that I was doing, the new music project, I also took on another thing which probably maybe wasn't entirely wise. I agreed to perform the complete Prokofiev Sinfonia Concertante transcribed for piano with a cellist. And that's, of course, if you know this piece, the Sinfonia Concertante, it's an amazing composition, a late work by Prokofiev. It's very long, very complicated. It has a very intricate orchestra part, and so when it's transcribed for the piano, it's very difficult indeed to really emulate the sound of the orchestra and to make it successful and smooth and really work well on the piano. But that was what I did. Unfortunately, the performance got canceled, so all my work was kind of for naught in that sense, but it's really an ill wind that blows no one any good, because the upshot is that I learned the concerto. I know how to play the accompaniment now, so if anyone ever asks me again, I'll be able to do it. And it was quite an interesting experience, because I found some, I think, very good solutions for technical problems in the reduction. Places where I felt that I needed to change Prokofiev's reduction to improve it a little bit, to make it more playable, and just actually to make it more close to the sound of an orchestra, for the kind of ease that an orchestra has in realizing complicated contrapuntal textures. So you might be thinking that's a little odd, right? Because Prokofiev made the reduction himself. Ostensibly, if the composer made the reduction, you would think that it should be perfect. You could just play it as is. Prokofiev was a great pianist. He knew what he was doing, right? And to a certain extent, I think that's true, but you have to remember that when Prokofiev would have been making a reduction like this, it's not clear how many opportunities he would have had to test it out practically before having to send it to be published. So even though I think everything that he writes is possible, it's definitely practicable, some things are so awkward. There are just certain moments which are so awkward that to play them exactly as written, you could certainly do it, but it's not really going to sound like how the orchestra sounds. It's not going to have that kind of ease, rhythmic ease, or effortless kind of clarity. And if you just make some very small adjustments, you can actually attain that kind of sound much easier. And I posit that, if you'd actually heard Prokofiev, for example, playing the accompaniment, he probably would have ended up in the moment simplifying some things much more than what he actually put into the published version. So I could talk about quite a few passages from this piece, and in fact from many orchestral reductions that I've worked on over the years, but I thought I would choose one in particular to start with. This is from the first movement of the concerto, and it's a particularly tricky passage. The melody here, the main melody, is in the inner voices. It's the horns, and Prokofiev has written this in octaves, and he's split the octaves between the two hands of the pianist, as you can see. It switches from being played only by the left hand to being kind of split between the right hand and the left hand. The upper voice is violin, and that's the figuration and 32nd notes. This figuration does kind of outline the same melody that the horns have, so it's kind of a heterophony in that sense, that there's kind of like an improvised part on top, which is kind of following the melody in outline. And then there's also a bass line, which I believe is pizzicato strings. Again, don't quote me on that, though. I don't have the full score in front of me at the moment, but I believe it's pizz. So it's quite tricky. You have to divide the melody between both hands. You have to get the bass. You have to get this figuration on top. And I discovered some little simplifications that I could make that would make this passage so much easier. So of course I have my fingerings here as well, so if you're curious you can see what my fingering solutions were. But the main thing I found was that I could leave out certain notes here and there and redistribute others. So in the second measure here, you'll notice I've actually whited out the doublings, the upper doublings of the melody in the right hand. So in the original, Prokofiev would have had you playing those with your right hand. You would have had to play octaves and then fill in the 32nd notes, which is certainly possible, but a little bit awkward and actually unnecessary because the 32nd note melody already doubles that melody. So you don't really need a triple doubling. I think just the upper and lower notes are plenty. That's enough here. So I continue that into the next measure. Again, we have a similar situation where Prokofiev has doubled the melody in the inner part in the right hand, and this is particularly difficult to play if you have to play those inner notes. It's just very, very awkward. Okay, so on this line, this is where I get even a little bit more elaborate with the simplifications. So again, I've left out the doublings on the first beat there. You see I've widened them out, and that makes the figuration way easier to play. And then I've also left out the lower doublings on those triplets at the end of the first bar. That means that you don't have to jump all the way down to play that in octaves with your right hand. And I've also gotten rid of the F sharp and the lower doubling in the last bar. But I've put the F sharp into the left hand so that you don't lose the fullness of the harmony in this passage. So even though this actually means that the melody kind of skips octave at this point, because you play that high E with your thumb on the right hand and then the lower D in the left hand. However, the figuration traces those notes. You'll see that the higher D is played in the figuration immediately afterwards. So you still kind of hear it actually when the passage is actually played. So here I am doing a few attempts at practicing this passage. You can actually kind of hear my manner of practicing. So that's why the rhythm is a little uneven when you hear this. It's because I'm actually just practicing it and kind of slowing down as I feel myself approaching parts which need a little bit more time to kind of fit the technique together. This is a very important method of practicing, actually, which I use all the time. I think a lot of people think that you have to always practice strictly in time, but actually not. As long as your inner sense of pulse is very strong, you can kind of let your fingers take you to whatever speed is comfortable for you. It's absolutely vital, though, to be able to look ahead and see, kind of be able to tell when a passage is coming up which is going to trip you up, and you need a little bit of time to just put those notes very solidly in place. And so that's a very standard way of practicing that I have. Of course, that's not to say sometimes you would want to practice very much in strict tempo. This is just sometimes, particularly when I'm in an earlier stage with learning a particular passage. So there you have it. That's my solution for that passage. And I think there are passages like this all over the place in the repertoire for orchestral reductions. And the question always arises, how can you make the piano sound as much as possible like the orchestra? How can you maintain as much detail as possible while still giving yourself the maximum amount of ease? Because for an orchestra, this stuff always sounds pretty easy because every part is being played by a different instrument. Now, for the pianist, of course, we have to jump all over the place to get everything. How can we make that sound as easy as possible so that there are as few as possible jumps, there are as few as possible awkward hand shifts and positions and so forth, while still maintaining the richness and the fullness of the sound? So actually, I'm also today doing a little performance of the Barber Violin Concerto with the orchestra reduced for second piano, and that's one that, again, Barber did his own reduction, and Barber was certainly not necessarily a virtuoso pianist, but he knew how to write for the piano. I mean, he wrote there's the Magnificent Piano Sonata, for example, which is wonderfully written for the piano, and many other pieces. Nonetheless, in the final movement, there are several passages which are actually unplayable at his printed tempo. I mean, they're literally unplayable in the reduction. So everyone has to find their own way of kind of getting around that. And some of them are just, he's tried to put as much detail in as possible. I almost feel like he's put in as much detail as possible so that the player can choose what to leave out and what to keep in. So I've come up with my own solution for playing that finale, and I think it's a pretty good solution, actually. So if you're curious to see how I kind of cheat my way around the hard things in that as well, I'd be happy to do a video and talk about that. So maybe leave me a comment if you're interested in hearing more videos about how I do simplifications, how I do facilitations of these difficult orchestral reductions. I'd be happy to talk about it some more. This technique actually does apply sometimes even to music written for the piano, particularly by composers who were not virtuoso pianists themselves. So, for example, a piece that I play a lot and very much love is The Wanderer Fantasy by Schubert. And I think I've talked about that there's actually an arrangement for solo piano by Franz Liszt. And even though I think he goes overboard with some of the changes that he makes, there are certain just very clever redistributions or simplifications that he makes that absolutely make sense. And I'm sure Schubert would have actually done if he thought of them, at the time. And even in pieces by great pianists, there are sometimes little things like that you notice, even if a composer is a great pianist, they might not always think of every possible solution to a problem, and there might be a slightly better one just hiding away there, which doesn't change the basic sound of the passage, doesn't violate the spirit of the passage, but makes it much easier, and in fact, actually makes the musical effect come out much clearer. For future videos, I might want to talk about that some more, and just feel free to let me know if that's interesting. But in the meantime, I better sign off now because I need to leave pretty soon to go to this performance. So thank you for watching and for supporting the channel. And until next time, this is Cole Anderson signing off.